What's wrong with my hands? What's wrong with my mind? She wanted to blurt it all out. Mummy, help me, please help me. Everything's strange and nothing's right, and my mind feels as if it's made up of pieces, and some of them are missing. Now, this may sound almost like a piece of metaphorical poetry, however, it is in fact a very short, almost summary of the book Cuckoo Song by Frances Hardinge, all taken from page 6. That's right, not only is there a summary at the very beginning of the book, but a first-time reader would have no idea. This method of telling the story without the readers even realizing is what I like to call trigger words. Words that are utilized to set the story subconsciously. Consider this. Words often come with an innate prejudice, feeling, or thought process attached, so when used with purpose, those specific words can make a reader intuitively feel and understand a book without the author explicitly telling what the book is about. Or, alternatively, the author may give key information before the reader understands what this information means, almost like clues or Easter eggs hidden in plain sight. It is a very clever literary style that helps to not only create an atmosphere for the book, but helps to set the story in motion and build the story that the world is set in. Within the first chapter, there are 2 types of trigger words. They are triggers for genre. It's a dark and twisted fairy tale, just a heads up. Triggers for story, to give us clues for the future. And once I've shown you what they are, I'll explain how the triggers can hide in plain sight. Basically, why they work so well. Before I delve into some examples of how they are used, however, I'll give you a quick rundown of the story. As the synopsis goes, when Triss wakes up after an accident, she knows that something is very wrong. She is insatiably hungry. She keeps waking up with leaves in her hair, and her sister seems terrified of her. When it all gets too much and she starts to cry, her tears are like cobwebs. Soon, Triss discovers that what happened to her is more strange and terrible than she could ever have imagined, and that she is quite literally not herself. In a quest to find the truth, she must travel into the terrifying underbelly of the city to meet a twisted architect who has dark designs on her family, before it's too late. The story is told in a small English town post-World War I. It's set at a point in time where uncertainty runs deep and change is abundant in the world. Change and uncertainty are a large part of this story's theme. Key plot points, without spoiling too much, are that there's a society of Fae called the Besiders, who live under the city and are led by the architect mentioned in the synopsis. Triss's father, a well-known architect for the real world, has tried to break connections with the Fae architect, which has resulted in a very Fae accident for Triss. She is no longer fully herself. Now, onto the examples within the text. My first and favourite form of trigger word used by Hardinge are triggers for genre. These triggers are all connected to the genre of the book, that being dark and twisted fairy tale. By implementing words that allude to animalistic and natural sources, the author is placing you subconsciously into the mindset of all things Fae without you realizing. She swallowed and found her throat dry and crackly as bracken. You had a fever, so of course you feel rotten and a bit muddled. Her father had a deep and pleasant voice, with a touch of hoarseness that made Triss think of rough animal fur. She could have easily used different metaphors to get the same notion across to the reader as she has done for other characters. For example, there were warning sounds in the rising pitch of Mother's voice, like the whistle of a kettle coming to the boil. Or, the sound faded away until even the words she thought she had heard vanished from her mind like breath from glass. But with this technique, she can allude to the fairy tale genre from the beginning of the book without actually having any Fae characters in the first chapter. A recurring theme amongst Chapter 1's genre triggers is frogs. As seen here, there are many mentions of either the word froglet or of a frog's sound or appearance. The word grimmer made Teresa feel cold and shuddery, as if somebody had pressed frog skin against her neck. I don't remember. She wanted to squirm away from the thought. Tris pulled out her diary, opened it, and gave a small croak of shock. "Oh, Froglet, I am so sorry." The sight of the ripped diary had filled Tris with the same cold, squirming feeling in the pit of her stomach that the mention of the grimmer had given her. There is also the heavy mention of the colour green. The room itself was as green as the leaves, green counterpane on the bed, green walls with little cream-coloured diamonds on them, fussy green squared cornered cloths on the black wood tables. This all alludes to the grimmer, the pond that Tris's accident occurred in. All the mentions of it are wet, green, eerie, and wild, just like the Fae in this book. The second trigger type is triggers for story. It's fun to implement as an author and to find as a reader, usually on your second read. Story triggers are subtle mentions to things that will be further developed in the story. My favourite example of this from the first chapter is the mention of the big tortoiseshell-handled scissors, which snipped with a slow, throaty crunch, as if relishing every inch. The big scissors seemed impossibly heavy, and her grip on them kept slipping, so that they almost seemed to twist rebelliously in her hand. After the second time that she had nearly caught her own knuckles between the blades, her mother took them back. This is a key plot point, and scissors play a big part in this story. Mentioning them in the first chapter is a fun little clue for later in the story. For more context, the Fae within this book can only live within the uncertain areas of the world, making post-World War I England a pretty good hiding spot. With that said, certainty is their biggest enemy. From a quote later in the book, a knife is made with 100 tasks in mind: stab, slice, fray, carve, but scissors are really intended for one job alone, snipping things in two, dividing by force. Everything on one side or the other, and nothing in between. Certainty. Tris's struggle with the scissors in the first chapter are an indication of what the accident entailed, and that she may not be who everyone thinks she is. Some other triggers for story are character specific, in that they revolve around who, or what, Tris actually is. Her head hurt. There was a sound grating against her mind, a musicless rasp like the rustling of paper. Somebody had taken a laugh, crumpled it into a great crackly ball, and stuffed her skull with it. 7 days, it laughed. 7 days. It felt as if there was a vast expanse of her weighted down with rocks, and it was a surprise to see herself stretched out as a normal-sized lump under the counterpane and blankets. Tris knew that she had always loved pinning pattern to cloth, cutting out, then watching the fabric pieces slowly become a shape, bristling with pins and ripped by fray-edged seams. As mentioned in the synopsis, Tris is quite literally not herself for most of the book, and these 2 sentences are clues for what she may actually be. Without the context of the rest of the story, these instead can be considered simply as tastefully descriptive metaphors. With context, and a minor spoiler here, it is a hint at not Tris's origin as a changeling, a being made up of twigs, stones, and magic, only to be alive for 7 days. Now, on to how the triggers are hidden in plain sight and why they work so well. Most of the trigger words are hidden in metaphor, so not to stand out too much, as an unusual choice of wording. The author is an obvious fan of metaphors and similes, considering just how many are on each page. But, since they usually have some form of trigger word among them, are brilliantly emotive, and suit the genre so well, It is understandable. Not all of her metaphors have a trigger word in them, so as to not saturate the text and/or make the triggers too noticeable. Overall, there are more similes than metaphors. However, they are used more for emotion and less for story or genre triggers. When the trigger words are not within the metaphors or similes, they can be found in dialogue. Even the characters that are desperate to have nothing to do with this strange situation unwittingly use a fair amount of trigger words that fit the situation perfectly. For examples of triggerless similes, metaphors, and accidentally trigger-filled dialogue, there are these quotes. That seemed a bit more natural, like a book falling open on a much-viewed page. Tris was startled by how blue her eyes were, like the glass beads around her neck. Clear and fragile, too, just like the beads. It was a kind, bright look that needed only the slightest change to become a frightened look. Now, you've been very ill, so I expect your brain feels as if it's full of cotton wool at the moment, doesn't it? Well, don't you panic. Over the next couple of days, all your wits will come home, I dare say, dragging their tails behind them. Having descriptive metaphors and similes without the triggers helps to hide ones that use triggers in plain sight, and using triggers in dialogues helps embed them more into the story. Now, on to how I applied this technique. I started with a draft that I had about a group of people hiding in a bunker from a sandstorm. Within the first few pages, I purposely didn't want to say what it is that they were hiding from, just so I could build intensity and mystery. This was especially since, as you find out at the end, it was never just the sandstorm that they were hiding from, but an accidental death executed by their leader, and the body is still outside. In this first draft, you can see that the green words are the ones that could be considered trigger words, as they allude to either the genre, that being the sandstorm, and story, which, as I mentioned before, had actually begun with a death. In my edited version, you can clearly see more green words that allude in greater detail to the genre and story. For example, instead of "they could barely breathe, the stillness thick around them," I wrote it to be "they could barely breathe, the stillness feeling both humid and dry as hot breath spilled from thirsty mouths." I also added metaphor and similes with trigger words. The original had a whisper in his ear, and now there's a simile, a whisper like sandpaper in his ear. From "yeah," she said, drawing it out, "but it'll soon be death in here if you don't do something," to a metaphor. "Yeah," she said, drawing it out, her beady eyes drilling holes into his crumbling resolve, "but it'll soon be death in here if you don't do something." I wanted to push the sand idea as subtly as I could through trigger words, in order to replicate Frances Hardinge's style and tell the story, or at least give hints at it, without being explicit. To conclude, Frances Hardinge's Cuckoo song is a descriptive masterpiece with trigger words sewn throughout sentences in order to portray feelings or thoughts, without telling the reader why they feel or think that way. The two types of trigger words she tends to use are triggers for genre and triggers for story. I hope you have learnt a thing or two during this presentation and are at least a little bit interested in replicating this wonderful book's style, or at least reading the book in its entirety. It is definitely worth the read.